Good morning guys, and welcome back to Dazzle Koi. Today I'm going to talk chlorine, all things chlorine. So koi keeper, any fish keeper will be aware of the issues caused by chlorine. Today I'm going to go through everything you ever need to know about it in order to kind of keep your fish happy and healthy. So firstly, I'm going to talk very quickly about what chlorine actually is. So kind of knowing your enemy is a good place to start. So we'll go through what exactly chlorine is. Then I'll talk about why it's in your water supply and how it finds its way in there and why in the water supplied to your home by your water supply company. Then I'll go on and look at what impact chlorine has on koi and pond fish and all fish in general. So what effect it has on them, how it causes a problem and why. I'll then go through how you can prevent chlorine coming into contact with your fish in the first place, what you can do kind of to control it, to get rid of it, and as I say, stop your fish coming into contact with it at all. I'll then go through how to test for chlorine, so how to test your pond water to make sure you have zero chlorine in there, which zero is the target at all times. So how to test the water to make sure you don't have any chlorine in there. I'll also tell you how to determine if you have chloramine in your supply, and I'll talk about chloramine and why and what that is and how it differs to chlorine. But I will tell you how to find out if you have chloramine in your water supply. And then lastly, I'll talk about how to treat your koi, how to handle the situation where you accidentally expose your koi or your fish to chlorine. We'll talk about what you can do to sort of help them through that. So firstly, chlorine, what is it? Chlorine is an element, so by that I mean it's a basic material that can't be broken down any further into other materials. It's a single material, appears on the periodic table. The atomic number of chlorine is 17, and in its natural form chlorine exists as a gas. So if I had some chlorine in front of me to show you, it would be a cloud of like a yellow gas. It's mildly toxic, corrosive gas. It's an oxidant, it's an irritant. If you get the gas in your eyes, it makes your eyes water, irritates your eyes, etc. But I think the key thing to take from this is that it's a gas. That is very important. In its natural form at room temperature, chlorine is a gas. Just in terms of very quickly what an element is, so an element appears on the periodic table. As I say, it's the very basic form of material. It can't be broken down. So I'll use the example of water. We all know the chemical formula for water is H2O, and what that is H for which is hydrogen, 2, so 2 hydrogen atoms, and O, oxygen, so 1 oxygen atom. So the O is oxygen, which is an element. The H is hydrogen, which is an element, and in the form of water, it's a single oxygen atom with hydrogen atom attached and then a second hydrogen atom attached, and that altogether is a molecule, and that molecule is water, H2O. So chlorine is an element, as is oxygen, as is hydrogen. And the chemical formula, as I say, is Cl. It's a capital C, lowercase l. So that's what chlorine actually is. So moving on to why it's in our water supplies. So firstly, tap water is obviously very pure, highly purified, very, very clean, very safe, free of bacteria, etc. When it is the process of that purification is complete at the water purification plant. However, when it's then pumped through pipework underground and it can sit in tanks and be stored, the time from leaving that purification process to arriving at your tap, a lot can happen to it, and if left to its own devices, you will form bacteria in there. You'll pick up unwanted things in there, and it reaches your tap and it's no longer in the pristine condition that it left the plant in, and it's potentially unsafe. And so to get round that, chlorine is added to the water at the treatment plant, and that chlorine effectively is a disinfectant that kills any bacteria that may try to form. It stops bacteria forming, and it helps the water get to your tap in the condition it's meant to be in. So effectively, if you think of it as a protective wrapper on the water, it stays, because the pipes are under pressure and contained oxygen-free environment, the chlorine stays in the water, that wrapper stays on. When it reaches your tap, you turn your tap on, the water comes out. That chlorine, if you remember, I said it's a gas in its natural state, so it's kind of being forced into the water, but it doesn't want to stay in there. It wants to come out of the water, and left to its own devices, in a bowl, in a pond, etc., that chlorine will come out of the water, and that's called gassing off, which you've probably heard. So essentially, a good point I'll make now, actually, when water leaves the tap and the chlorine is removed, at that point, that is the best quality water you can provide for your fish. Our job as fish keepers really is to keep the water in that condition. So from that point, once the chlorine is removed, it's only downhill from there for the quality of the water. And I see often people will start up a new pond, they'll fill it with water, and then they leave it weeks or even months, thinking that something is happening to that water, preparing it somehow for the fish. But the reality is, the second they filled it from the tap and the chlorine was gone, that was the best quality. It just goes downhill from there. So worth noting. Now, chlorine is added, as I say, to disinfect that water, to keep it in good condition. Chlorine gas is used. Also, another way of adding chlorine to the water is by using chloramine rather than chlorine itself. And this is more and more being the case, that water companies are now more and more using chloramine instead of chlorine. The reason being, chlorine itself, there's very rare circumstances where it can react with organic materials and form quite a nasty byproduct, effectively, that's carcinogenic. Not to frighten anyone, it's a very rare, very rare occurrence, but there is a very slim chance. So to avoid that, chloramines are used instead of chlorine. Also, chloramine stays in the water. It's not gaseous, and it's not naturally wanting to leave the water, and that is kind of the issue where chloramine affects us more than chlorine, because with chlorine, given enough time, it will be gone of its own natural accord, where chloramine won't. Chloramine is stable in the water, it will stay in there, so you have to physically remove the chloramine. So it's, I guess, a good point to take from that. If you need to know, I suggest if you don't know, you find out immediately. You need to know if your supplier adds chloramine to your water or if they're still using chlorine, because it is a different animal, and the way of dealing with it is different. So get out there now and find out. I will show you a little later on how to test for chloramines and determine chloramines in your water. Okay, moving on to the impact chlorine has on koi. If you've seen my nitrate video, you'll be aware of how nitrate impacts koi. So it basically impairs the blood's ability to carry oxygen around the body to the organs, to do its job of transporting oxygen around your fish. And nitrate is very similar in that respect to chlorine. So chlorine also impacts on the blood's ability to carry oxygen. So the more chlorine a koi is exposed to, or the longer it's exposed to a level of chlorine, the less capacity the blood has to carry oxygen. And you'll have heard the term brown blood disease. This is because the blood is losing its ability to carry oxygen. It becomes brown, and you see it predominantly in the gills. Instead of being a nice pink red colour, the gills become brown. And this is exactly the same with chlorine exposure. So essentially, exposing your koi to chlorine is reducing its blood's capacity to carry oxygen, and so it manifests itself in the same kind of way. So the symptoms of chlorine exposure are the same as for nitrate. So you'll see lethargy, your fish will be clamped up, they'll sulk about, or they will gulp at the surface for oxygen despite the water being highly oxygenated, occasionally flashing, but also the colour in the gills. The gills darken, they become less pink stroke red and move towards brown. The longer they're exposed to chlorine, the more brown and the more evident that becomes. So that's the impact it has on your koi. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but the target for chlorine levels in your pond is 0. There is no safe level. It's difficult to measure accurately. Above 0.37 milligrams per litre of chlorine and all fish life will be dead. But as I say, even at the tiniest trace amount, it's doing damage and you need to get rid of it. So don't worry too much about putting a number on the chlorine level. The number is 0. It's either there and that's bad, needs to be fixed, or it's not there and that's good. Now, in terms of how to handle the chlorine and how to prevent your koi or your fish being exposed to chlorine levels, several different ways. One method is using a physical dechlorinator, such as you'll have heard of a Big Blue, like this one, or a 3-stage dechlorinator. Those units will take out chlorine using activated carbon, and they will do so on a continuous process, albeit with a very small flow. Now, there's a lot of downsides to these. One is the cost. They're expensive to buy. They're expensive also to keep the units working properly. So you need to replace filters in them very regularly. Another downside is a lot of people put one on and they put too much flow through it, and so what the water coming out at the other end still has chlorine in, but they falsely think it hasn't. And also they put the right flow in, but within a few months that performance has dropped off and the chlorine is starting to creep up, and people don't realise. And again, false sense of security, they think they're covered when in reality they're not. Personally, I've never owned a dechlorinator in my 26 years keeping koi. I've never owned one and I never will, and I'll talk about why in a little while. But if you do decide to go down that route, it is absolutely vital that you regularly test the output of that. And by regularly I mean weekly, because it will deteriorate and then it will drop off a cliff. You need to test it weekly, and again, as I say, I'll tell you how to test that in a little while. Other methods of dechlorinating, removing the chlorine from your water. Chemical dechlorination. So you'll buy a little bottle of Tap Safe or Chlor Go, or lots of different names for it. Come in a little tiny bottle. They have fancy koi, colourful pictures of koi on, and they cost 15 quid for a little bottle. You add that to your water, it will remove the chlorine. Now, these manufacturers like to keep it a secret what's in there, but essentially what most of them are made from is sodium thiosulfate dissolved in water. So if you take the £15 that you spend on a bottle of chlorination product, specifically with koi taxon, etc., if you spend that £15 on some sodium thiosulfate crystals from eBay, that £15 will last you probably many years. It'll last you 100 times longer than the equivalent bottle of chemical dechlorinator, and it's the same product. What sodium thiosulfate does is it removes chlorine from the water. If your water supplier just uses chlorine, sodium thiosulfate will take the chlorine out, end of, instantly. If your supplier uses chloramine, then sodium thiosulfate will take out the chlorine element of the chloramine. But chloramine is also bound up with other things, one of them being ammonia. So the sodium thiosulfate will remove the chlorine element. It will leave behind trace levels of ammonia, and it is very small levels. It is trace levels of ammonia. Your biological filter will mop them up, no problem, won't cause you an issue, but just worth being aware that it does leave behind a little bit of ammonia. It's very small. Also, and probably more importantly, more of a worry really, more of a risk I guess, when you take out the chlorine, you also liberate some salt. The risk with that is that salt, if you have zeolite in your system anywhere to mop up ammonia, when you add salt to that system, so if you liberate some salt from the chloramines using sodium thiosulfate, that salt will cause the ammonia that's bound up in the zeolite to be released back into your pond. Now, that's probably more of a problem. It isn't a problem, you can manage that, but it's, again, something to be aware of. Okay, so if I go on to testing for chlorine, you would always test for chlorine pond water. So you take a sample of your pond water, and what you want in order to do that is called DPD4 tablets. You can get these again off eBay, they don't cost a lot. It's a little tablet. So you take a sample of your pond water in a little tube of some form, 10mm sample of water, drop a DPD4 tablet in. You can crumble it up if you wish, but drop it into the water, agitate it. Within 10-20 seconds the tablet will dissolve, and then within 10-20 seconds again, if that water has any pink tint to it, and it's good to, if you put the tube onto a piece of white paper and look down through the tube, so you see looking through the most volume of water that you can, any kind of pink tinge indicates chlorine is present. It's not a number, you can't put a number on it with a DPD4 tablet, but you don't need to. If it's there, you need to address it. If it's not there, all good. So this will tell you yes or no, black and white, or pink and white. Within 30 seconds or so, you need to, if you see any pink, it's there. Much longer than that, if it's clear, then you don't have chlorine. But be aware that it's an oxidation process essentially. So if you leave that water in time, in minutes, in hours, whatever it takes, that water will go pink. So you need to be looking at it within, 30 seconds, 40 seconds of the tablet going in, agitate, dissolve, instantly look for the colour. Don't worry if 5 minutes later you see there's some pink there, that's just the natural oxidation, that's not chlorine. Say within a minute, if there's nothing there within a minute, then your water is clear. In terms of chloramines, so you wouldn't test your pond water for chloramines, you would test your tap water. And basically, two ways. One, I would suggest you do both, if I'm honest, belt and braces. Contact your water provider. Now these days, they're quite up to date, so a lot of them are online. But if you ask them for a report on your water analysis, they have to provide that. I'll have a look on that report. You're looking for chlorine, chloramine, dichloramine, trichloramine, those type of compounds with the chloramine word in. If they're not there, you don't have chloramine in your water supply. Quite often now, someone asked me about a Severn Trent water supply this week. I looked, it's literally a case of going onto Severn Trent water website, you put your postcode in and it gives you the water report for your area. I don't think all suppliers are that good, but a lot of them are, so do check it out. Then, and I would say in addition to that as well, I would always recommend you do both. Get yourself a test kit like this one, and what this does, it's a strip, not the most accurate form of test, the strips, I'll be honest, but it's all we've got to work with. Get yourself one of these or any other similar kit that does the same. You want something that tests for chlorine, total chlorine, and also free chlorine. Now take a sample of water again, dip the strip in the water. This will give you a number. I say not highly accurate, but it'll give you a number for total chlorine, it'll give you a number for free chlorine. Now the total chlorine is chlorine, free chlorine and chloramine added together. So if that comes to, let's say 1, let's just put a number on it, total chlorine is 1. Free chlorine, if your free chlorine is also 1 and the difference between them is nothing, then you don't have chloramines in your supply. If however your free chlorine was 0.5 and your total was 1, then the difference between those two is 0.5. That's unaccounted for, and that 0.5 is chloramine. So to summarize, if your free chlorine and your total chlorine are the same, you don't have chloramines. If there is a difference between the free and total, then that difference is chloramine. So that's how you test your supply water, not your pond, your supply water out the tap, immediately out the tap, for chloramine. So I suggest, if you do nothing else, you do that immediately and you find out if you have chlorine only or if you have chloramine in there. And the reason I say you need to know, as I say, it is treated very differently. If you've got chloramines in there, if you're using the sodium thiosulfates or for example, you need to know, because you need to be aware that you're going to release that trace element of ammonia. You need to know you can't do that, use that with zeolite in there, etc. The key difference between the two is that chloramine is stable in water. I think I mentioned that, but it goes, they put it into the water and it stays in there, it doesn't come out. So with chlorine, you can allow it to gas off. You can use methods of gassing off to remove the chlorine. With chloramine, you can't. You must remove it yourself. Now, moving on to the third method of chlorine removal, which is to allow it to gas off naturally. Now, if you, I'll use the example of my pond, and as I say, I've done this for 26 years. This is what I'm doing now, but I have done this on all my ponds. I have a constant trickling of fresh water from the tap. And the key is it is from the tap. So I put in, at the moment, about 40%, 50% of my pond volume per week is trickled in and replaced. I've been up to 100% a week. I've been down to 20%, but at the moment, 40%, around 40% of my pond volume is added every week in the form of a trickle in of water containing chlorine. I don't have chloramines in my supply. Now, with that rate of trickle in at 40–50%, I have never, in my time keeping koi, generated a level of chlorine in my water. I've never had a measurable amount of chlorine present in my pond when constantly trickling in 24/7, 365 days a year, tap water that contains chlorine. It gasses off naturally quicker than I am adding it at 40% trickle per week, no problem. As I say, some people think that's controversial. I test it. I have never ever had a level of chlorine in my pond doing that. You can't do that with chloramine. If you have chloramine in your supply, that will not gas off. It will never gas off. It will just accumulate until it reaches a level that's harmful to your koi, and you see the symptoms of chlorine exposure, as I talked about earlier. So 3 methods: a chlorination unit, chemical dechlorinator, natural gassing off. You choose what is best for you, what you're most comfortable with, your budget, etc. Three methods all have their merit. I would say, even if you use a mechanical dechlorinator, even if you spend money on the koi specific pond dechlorinators, even all those things considered, still get on eBay, get yourself a bag of sodium thiosulfate crystals, stick it in your filter shed, because in an emergency it will save your koi's life. You may think you don't need it, but there's always a circumstance where you'll wish you had it. It will come up at some point, so get yourself a bag of that, get it in the shed. It costs a couple of quid. It's not expensive at all. So in terms of what you can do to help your fish if you expose them accidentally to chlorine, there is no treatment for chlorine exposure, unfortunately, so you can't buy a product and put it in and all will be right. Basically, what you have to do, immediately get the fish out of the water containing chlorine. That could be that you take the fish out and put it into some fresh water that has no chlorine in, or it could be that you throw in a handful of sodium thiosulfate to remove the chlorine, or a chemical dechlorination product. Whatever method you wish to use, you need to immediately remove the chlorine from the water that the koi is in. You need to then add as much oxygen as you possibly can, because your koi will have reduced capacity. However, what level of reduction depends on the strength of the chlorine, the time it was exposed, etc. But it will have a reduced capacity to utilize oxygen. So get as much oxygen into water as you possibly can. If you do that and your koi is alive for a couple of hours in the fresh water, then 99% that koi will live. If you keep it alive, you don't get to the point where it can't get enough oxygen in its blood, then chances are it will live. And the good news, the light at the end of the tunnel, is that that blood oxygen carrying capacity is repaired continuously, and a full damage will be done and dusted within about 3 months, about 12 weeks. But it is a continuous process, and once you get that fish into fresh water, that process will be ongoing, and over time it will gradually improve, and eventually it will be fully repaired. As long as you keep the fish alive, it will repair, it will recover. I think I've just thought of one thing that I'm pretty sure I missed out. I don't want to say toxicity, the damage that chlorine will do to your koi is dependent somewhat on pH. So the lower the pH of your pond is, the more damaging chlorine is to your koi, and conversely. So the higher your pH, the less impact chlorine exposure will have on your koi. It's not something you can do an awful lot about, it's not something you can use, but it's worth knowing, just for completeness. So yeah, the lower the pH, the more harmful chlorine is to your koi. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover there. Apologies, I've gone on a long time. Hopefully there's someone still awake. If that was useful to you, please do hit the like button. If you've got any questions or any comments, good, bad, indifferent, please do leave me a comment. I always like to read them, I like to reply to everything. If there's another video you'd like me to make, then do also put that in the comments. Just do check out the other videos on my channel. There's stuff on there for everyone now, lots of stuff on everything really, relating to koi. So until the next video, do look after yourself, do take care.